There's a man on a stage in the middle of a sold-out stadium, and he is moving, not walking, not gesturing, moving with a looseness that doesn't belong to someone who has lived through 8 decades of everything a human being can live through. You can see it in his feet, the way they find the stage like he owns the floor beneath them. His shoulders drop on a beat. His hands don't hold anything, don't protect anything. The crowd in front of him is 70,000 people. The air smells of sweat and pyro and hot concrete. And he is 82 years old, morning when everything changed. Jagger is older than most of the people watching this video. He has smoked, he has drunk, he has lived a life that by any reasonable biological accounting should have extracted a steep and visible price. He lost a partner to sudden cardiac death. I'm not here to sell you a supplement, a program, or a theory. There's a particular kind of discomfort that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't arrive as anger or grief or even envy in the clean sense of the word. In July 2025, footage circulated widely of Mick Jagger, 81 years old, performing before 60,000 people in Gelsenkirchen on the Stones' Hackney Diamonds tour, crossing a stage for 47 seconds, and in that time, he did not slow down once. That footage did something to people, and the easy interpretation, the one that protects you, is that you were impressed, amazed, that what you felt watching it was admiration and specific shame of comparison. The shame of standing next to a mirror that shows you not what you look like, but what you could have been or might still be, or are afraid you've already disqualified yourself from becoming. The shame of realizing that someone measurably older than you is functioning at a level you quietly believe is no longer available to you. Most people don't name it. They convert it into a dismissal, a joke, a conspiracy theory about what he must be injecting, what team of specialists he must employ, what impossible privileges make his vitality a trick rather than a truth. Because if it's a trick, the shame dissolves. If it's purchased or performed or artificially maintained, then it has nothing to do with the choices you've made, the years you've moved through, the body you've arrived at. But under the dismissal, the feeling doesn't leave. What the feeling is doing precisely is running a comparison you didn't ask to run. It is taking that 47 seconds of footage, his posture, his breath, his presence in his own body, and placing it next to your own inventory. The inventory you don't narrate out loud, but carry constantly. The mornings that require more effort than they used to. The stiffness that arrives before consciousness does. The fatigue that sometimes feels less like the result of something you did and more like the ambient condition of being the age you are. The slow, unnamed surrender to the idea that this is simply what happens now, and that the body declining is the contract you sign without realizing it. The footage doesn't create that inventory. It illuminates it. It throws light on something already compiled, already sitting in a drawer you don't often open. And the light feels like an indictment. Here is what actually interests me about that indictment. It is if you allow the word data, precise and personal data about where you have quietly drawn a line and decided that the territory beyond it no longer belongs to you. That line may not have been consciously drawn. It may have been drawn for you, incrementally, by accumulated cultural messaging, medical appointments, birthday humor that carries a small blade inside the joke. The line that says, vitality had a version available in your 30s, and that version is gone, and wanting it back at this age is either denial or vanity. What the research emerging from longevity science and biohacking communities in the last 5 years has established, with real data, not aspiration, is that this line is movable, not metaphorically movable, physiologically movable. The work being done on biological age versus chronological age, on VO2 max, as the single strongest predictor of longevity, on sleep architecture, on zone 2 training, on the specific hormonal and inflammatory markers that distinguish an 81-year-old who crosses a stadium stage from one who doesn't. That work is no longer fringe. It is published. It is measurable. It has protocols attached to it. The law of vibration, the law of attraction, what they describe as energetic frequency, maps, in practical terms, onto something the biohackers are documenting in cortisol levels, in heart rate variability, in the feedback loop between chronic low-grade stress and accelerated biological aging. The person who has quietly accepted decline is not simply thinking defeatist thoughts. They are running a physiological state that encodes that acceptance into tissue, into inflammation markers, into sleep quality that then degrades recovery, which then confirms the belief, which deepens the state. The loop is real. It runs in both directions. This is what the footage from Gelsenkirchen is actually showing you. Not a celebrity outlier, not a trick of privilege, but the visible surface of a different agreement. An agreement that was not signed quietly, that was not defaulted into by accumulated consensus. An agreement that was made actively, maintained deliberately, and that produces a body which, at 81, still receives the crowd on its feet. The shame you feel watching that footage is not a character flaw. It is the friction produced by a gap. The gap between what you assumed was possible for you and what the evidence in front of you suggests might actually be possible. That friction, when it burns in this particular way, is not pointing inward. It is pointing forward. It is the feeling of a line that can be redrawn. The question is not whether Mick Jagger has advantages you don't have. Some of them he does. The question is what portion of the gap between his trajectory and yours was inevitable, and what portion was the result of an agreement you made without negotiating because everyone around you was making the same agreement. And at some point, consensus becomes gravity. You can feel that gravity right now in the slight resistance to believing any of this applies to you specifically, in the comfortable familiarity of the inventory, in the reflex to locate him as the exception and yourself as the rule. That resistance is the agreement asserting itself. It can be renegotiated. The tools to do it are not abstract. They are specific, they are dateable, they're already being used by people who looked at a similar piece of footage and felt the same friction, and decided the friction was an instruction rather than a verdict. That is where we are going. You already know what it's like to carry something you can't quite name. Not a diagnosis, not a crisis, just a weight that arrived gradually, the way sediment settles. So slowly you stop noticing the water had changed color. You wake up and the body reports in before you've formed a single thought. Stiff, a little slow, the joints sending their quiet communiques. And somewhere underneath that, something older, the feeling that you have fallen behind some version of yourself you were supposed to still be. That feeling, the one that lives just below the rib cage, that tightens slightly when you catch a reflection moving through a window, that goes quiet when you're busy and returns when you're still. That feeling has a specific texture. It is not anxiety exactly. Anxiety is louder. This is more like finding a coat you meant to return and never did, still hanging by the door, slightly too heavy to ignore. A low-grade pressure around the chest. The faint smell of something left on too long. You recognize it not because you've named it, but because you've felt it before on Sunday evenings as a child when the weekend was over, when something unfinished was coming due. And right now, in the era of midlife that nobody told you would feel like this, that same sensation is running quietly in the background every morning. Not loud enough to address, not quiet enough to dismiss. Hold that. We'll come back to it. In the spring of last year, GQ published what could have been a throwaway feature. Mick Jagger at 82. What does he eat? What does he do? The kind of content that usually reads like a publicist's press release with a byline attached. But spend more than 5 minutes with the actual reporting and something shifts. Here is what the piece keeps circling back to. There is no elegant mystery at the center of this. No secret. The man doing ballet bar work at dawn, not as eccentricity, but as structured practice, for flexibility, for control, for the neuromuscular conversation between intention and movement that most people stop having in their 50s. The man finishing a cardio session that would leave trained athletes damp and slightly embarrassed. Not on camera, not for a brand deal, in a room before anyone has made the day worth documenting. The GQ reporters found a pattern accumulated across decades. Not a branded routine, not a trademark method, a pattern. And the texture of it, when you read carefully, is specific in ways that resist the usual explanations. The assumption, nearly universal, is that a body like his at 82 is exceptional genetics wearing the costume of lifestyle language. That the trainer, the schedule, the diet are decorative elements on a chromosomal foundation. That the real explanation is in the bloodline, and the rest is a story he gets to tell because he can afford the people who help him tell it. The reporting does not support this. What it documents is more inconvenient than genetics and more accessible than wealth. High-intensity physical effort, maintained not as a phase or a program with a start and end date, but as a structural constant across multiple decades. Dance cardio that is not symbolic, not the gentle kind marketed to people who want to feel they've moved. The real kind, sustained, demanding, the sort that produces a specific quality of tired that sits in the legs like warm sand. A relationship with sleep treated not as recovery from the day, but as preparation for the next one. A diet that is not theatrical in its restriction. Lean proteins, vegetables, the quiet absence of the processed architecture that constitutes the default Western plate, held without drama or announcement. And no substances. That detail is reported flatly, without moral freight. For several decades, no recreational chemistry. No cortical disruption, no hormonal cascading, no inflammatory overhead. Not recently. A long time ago. None of this is logistically cheap. He has trainers. He has a schedule that accommodates this structure, that is real and should not be minimized. But the reporting keeps returning to something that does not bend to the money argument. You can buy access to a trainer, but you cannot buy the decision to show up when you don't feel like it across 30 years. You can hire a chef, but you cannot outsource the interior posture that makes discipline feel less like punishment and more like correspondence, like writing back to something that wrote to you first. That distinction is where this story stops being about Mick Jagger. Because what you were carrying this morning when you read this chapter's opening, that low pressure around the chest, that coat by the door, that sense of something quietly coming due, it is not evidence of a character flaw. It is evidence of a specific curriculum you were handed, one that taught you to relate to the body as a project, a thing to be periodically corrected when it fell below an acceptable threshold, fixed in bursts, managed at intervals. The relationship, if you could call it that, was always conditional. You showed up when something was wrong, when a number alarmed you, when the mirror finally said something you couldn't unhear. What the GQ profile describes is a different posture entirely. Not a program with better specs. A different way of standing in relation to the body. Continuous, reciprocal, attentive in the way that relationships require attention, not in the way that problems require solutions. That reframe is not comfortable, is not supposed to be. What the piece does, if you let it, is clarify rather than shame. And there is a difference between those two things that matters enormously at this stage of life. Shame says, you failed. Clarity says, you were working from an incomplete map. The incomplete map told you the body was a project, a set of numbers to be managed, a problem that willpower or money could solve when you finally got around to solving it. The map Jagger's actual life describes is different. It describes something continuous, something that responds not to periodic intervention, but to sustained attention, not to intensity alone, but to intensity held inside a relationship that has lasted long enough to know you. And here, right here, is where the question becomes genuinely interesting. Because if genetics doesn't explain this, and if the money argument dissolves once you look at what money cannot actually purchase, the showing up, the years, the interior posture, then something else is doing the structural work. Something that holds the relationship together across decades, when discipline alone would have burned out, when motivation would have faltered, when the routine would have collapsed under the accumulated friction of ordinary life. Something keeps this coherent over time that is not willpower and not wealth. That thing has a name, and it turns out that naming it correctly, not as a protocol, not as a philosophy, but as a specific biological mechanism you already carry, changes not just what you do next, but why you'd bother doing it at all. That is where this goes, and it is closer than you think. There is something you might be feeling right now, if you have been sitting with this series for more than a few days. Not hope exactly, not its opposite. Something more like suspicion, a quiet, slightly uncomfortable wondering about whether the story you have been telling yourself about your body is actually true or whether it is simply old. Whether what you have been calling realism is in fact just a very long-running instruction that you have never quite gotten around to questioning. That feeling is worth naming because it is the feeling this chapter is about. Last month, researchers at the Buck Institute for Research on Aging released updated findings from a decade-long longitudinal study tracking biological age markers against self-reported beliefs about aging in adults over 50. The headline numbers confirmed what smaller studies have been pointing toward for years. People who believed their best physical decades were behind them showed measurably accelerated cellular aging compared to people of identical chronological age who did not hold that belief. Not marginally, not in ways that required statistical squinting, in ways that showed up in telomere length, in inflammatory markers, in cardiovascular resilience, the deep biological infrastructure of the body, ticking along in quiet obedience to what the mind had told it to expect. The study did not make major news. It competed with other things. But if you had read it on the morning it was released, you might have sat with your coffee going cold and felt something shift slightly under you. Not a dramatic shift, not the ground opening, but the particular small vertigo of realizing that something you had filed under personal truth was actually a variable. Here's what I want to work through with you, because the study is the news, but the news points towards something larger. The belief that your body is on a slope did not arrive in you as a belief. It arrived as weather. You did not one day sit down and reason your way to the conclusion that the body negotiates downward after a certain point. You absorb it the way you absorbed everything real in childhood, through the texture of rooms, through the quality of silence that followed, certain conversations, through the way the adults around you moved through their 50s and 60s, the morning stiffness nobody mentioned, the activities quietly set aside, the particular flatness in someone's voice when they said "I used to." Your father's knees started protesting somewhere in his mid-50s. He stopped running. There was no announcement, no medical drama. Just one morning the running shoes were in a different place, and then eventually they weren't in the main rotation anymore. Your mother began prefacing things with "when I was younger" in a way that had a period at the end, not a comma. The people you loved shrank their physical lives inward by degrees, so gradual that no single degree was remarkable. You were not watching failure. You were watching compliance. They were following instructions they had received, the same instructions they were passing to you. Not through words, but through the daily evidence of their bodies. Medicine reinforced it, not through negligence, through architecture. Every waiting room, every intake form, every 5-minute appointment organized around the question, what is going wrong? And when build a framework for your body's future that faced entirely in one direction. The orientation was toward failure management. The assumption was decline, and the system positioned itself downstream of it. You received that infrastructure as prophecy. Advertising spent 40 years making the same argument with different packaging. Every cream promising firmness. Every supplement promising reversal. Every before and after photograph required the same foundational premise to function. That what your body was doing naturally was a malfunction. That the baseline was failure. That the correct response to aging was purchase. The industry needed you to see decline as the default so that intervention could have value. And so, with extraordinary consistency across decades of messaging, that is what you were shown. The cold white light of the skincare aisle at 10 p.m. The particular shame encoded in words like repair and restore, as though something had been broken rather than lived. None of this was a conspiracy. No institution sat down and decided to convince you. What happened was more ordinary and more pervasive than conspiracy. A set of assumptions about aging became so thoroughly embedded in the culture that they stopped functioning as assumptions and started functioning as facts. The map became the territory. The prediction became the instruction. And instructions given consistently enough over a long enough period, do not stay in the mind. They migrate into the body, into the posture, shoulders carrying forward, breath shallowing in the morning before the day has made any demand, into the decisions that never quite get made, the physical thing you nearly started and then didn't, not because of any concrete obstacle, but because some quiet calculation said that window has probably passed, into the cellular conversation itself. And this is biology, not metaphor, because the body systems are not sealed from the nervous system's expectations. They are listening. They are reading the hormonal and neurological climate shaped by what the system believes to be true about itself and responding accordingly. The way a house responds to its own thermostat. This is what the Buck Institute data surfaces so uncomfortably. The belief was not neutral. It was not simply information about the body. It was an instruction to the body. And the body, in its extraordinary faithfulness to the signals it receives, has been following that instruction ever since. I want to be precise about what this is not. It is not a reason for guilt. You did not choose the atmosphere you grew up inside. You did not select the medical model or design the advertising or decide how your parents were going to move through their own aging. You inherited all of it the way you inherit a river. You didn't pick its direction, but you have been shaped by its current, and the current has been running a long time. What it is, instead, is a reason for a specific quality of attention. Not alarm, not the brittle urgency of someone who has just been told they need to fix something, but the kind of attention that can hold a belief up to actual light. Not to punish it, not to perform positivity over it, but to look at it steadily and ask, does this describe something real, or was it simply repeated often enough that it learned to feel like something real? Because repetition is not evidence. Familiarity is not truth. And the uncomfortable implication of research like this, the thing that does not resolve cleanly, that you should be allowed to sit with rather than have wrapped up for you, is that a body which has spent decades receiving one set of instructions might, under genuinely different conditions, receive a different set. Whether it can, what genuinely different actually requires. Not at the conceptual level, not simply deciding to think more positively, which is its own kind of insult to the complexity of the situation, but at the level of the systems that have been organized around a particular expectation for decades. That question does not have a clean answer yet, but the weight of it is real, and it is worth sitting in that weight for a moment without resolving it, because the resolution, if there is one, will not come from being told what to think. It will come from somewhere that has to be earned. That is not a tease. That is the actual shape of how this works. You already know the feeling this chapter is about to describe. That quiet arithmetic you do sometimes late when the day has gone still, tallying the years you moved less than you meant to, adding up the seasons where the gym membership lapsed. The mornings you chose the car, the decades that passed in a kind of low-grade drift. Not guilt exactly, closer to a dull, unexamined weight. The sense that some door may have been quietly closing while you were busy with other things. That feeling is worth naming before anything else, because what follows either deepens it or dismantles it. And you deserve to know which direction this is heading before the science starts. It's heading towards something harder to dismiss than guilt, and more useful. You've heard the argument about genetics. You've probably made it yourself in that particular silence between deciding to go for a walk and deciding not to. The idea that some people are simply built differently. That longevity or vitality or the capacity to keep moving at 82 the way most men move at 50. That these things are written in the code you inherited, fixed before you arrived, decided by ancestors you never met. It's a reasonable position. It lets you off a particular kind of hook. But here's what the research actually shows when you press it. A 2022 meta-analysis published in Nature Aging, drawing on data from over 54,000 individuals across multiple decades, found that inherited genetic factors account for somewhere between 15 and 25% of what we'd call exceptional physical function in later life. A quarter at the generous end. The rest is what the researchers termed accumulated exposure, meaning the sum of what the body experienced repeatedly over time. Not what it was given, what was asked to do again and again across years that became decades. The weight of cultural inheritance, of family history, of whatever DNA you're carrying, it matters, but it is not the sentence. It is more like the starting line. What you do from there consistently for long enough rewrites the document. Now let's talk about what long enough actually does to tissue. Not to motivation, not to mindset, to the physical structure of muscle, bone, and metabolic function. There's a study from the University of Pittsburgh, published in the American Journal of Sports Medicine, that tracked master athletes, men and women who had maintained structured physical training for 30 or more years. The researchers used MRI to compare their quadriceps at 60, 70, and even 80 years of age with those of sedentary adults in the same age bracket. The images are striking in a way that a graph cannot capture. The sedentary muscle at 70 looks almost marbled. Fatty infiltration threading through the tissue like something you'd see in a cut of aged meat. Pale and soft and losing its definition. The long-term athlete's muscle at the same age looks closer to the tissue you'd expect in someone 20 years younger. Not identical, not invincible, but structurally coherent. Dense, organized. The researchers weren't measuring peak performance. They were measuring structural preservation. And what they found was that the difference wasn't primarily explained by what those athletes were doing now. It was the result of what had been done decades earlier, compounded year by year, until the tissue itself carried the memory of the work. The tissue carries the memory of the work. This is not metaphor. This is cellular biology. Skeletal muscle retains epigenetic modifications from repeated mechanical loading, methylation patterns, gene expression profiles, the satellite cell populations that govern repair capacity. A muscle that has been stressed and recovered thousands of times over 30 years develops a kind of structural literacy. It knows how to respond to demand. It has been responding to demand for so long that the response is written into the architecture. There's a term researchers use, muscle memory, and most of us associate with skill the way a pianist's fingers find the chord without thought. But there's a deeper version of this at work in long-term exercisers, something operating at the level of myonuclear density. When you train a muscle and it hypertrophies, grows, new myonuclei are added to the muscle fibers. And here's the part that took scientists by surprise. When you stop training, the muscle shrinks. The strength decreases. But those myonuclei don't disappear. They persist for years, possibly decades. The structural infrastructure of all that past work remains, dormant but present, waiting for the signal to resume. What Mick Jagger's body represents, from a tissue standpoint, is not a performance of extraordinary genetics. It represents the cumulative residue of approximately 5 decades of sustained, high-intensity physical demand. Every concert, 2 hours of cardiovascular output, lateral movement, full body expression at intensities that most recreational athletes don't sustain for 20 minutes. Every tour, every rehearsal, every discipline embedded into a life so thoroughly that it stopped being a choice and became the texture of his days. The structural record of all of it is still present. In the fiber density, in the myonuclear population, in the trabecular architecture of bone, and the metabolic machinery of a body that has been running for decades as a high-output system. The past is not behind him. It is in him, now at the bone. A 2019 study out of Osteoporosis International, examining competitive masters athletes over a 40-year longitudinal period, found that sustained high-impact mechanical loading, the kind produced by running, jumping, and weight-bearing movement, maintained trabecular bone density at levels 15 to 30% higher than age-matched sedentary controls. At the same age, in the same bodies the medical system tends to treat as uniformly fragile after 65. Bone is not passive. It is metabolically active tissue. It responds to load. It deposits mineral where stress is applied. And it remembers, in a structural sense, where stress has consistently been applied for a long time. The skeleton of a man who has spent decades in motion is architecturally different from the skeleton of a man who has spent decades avoiding it. Not slightly different, measurably, radiologically, clinically different. And metabolically, the story continues. Research published in Cell Metabolism in 2021 tracked mitochondrial function in long-term endurance athletes across age brackets and found that their mitochondrial density, the concentration of energy-producing units per unit of muscle tissue, remained significantly elevated compared to sedentary peers, even after controlling for current training volume. The body that trained hard in its 40s, 50s, and 60s has more mitochondria per gram of muscle at 80 than the body that did not. The infrastructure of energy production was built over years and then maintained, not because of what's happening now, but because of what happened then again and again, until the body stopped seeing the demand as exceptional and began treating it as baseline. Consistency across decades does not merely produce fitness. It restructures the body's expectations of itself. It changes what the tissue considers normal, which returns us to where this chapter began, to that quiet weight you've been carrying, the years that passed, the movement that didn't happen or happened inconsistently or kept getting deferred by things that felt more urgent at the time. If all of this is true, if the tissue holds the record, if the myonuclei accumulate and persist, if the bone architecture reflects the decades and not just the last year, then the person who spent those decades largely still is sitting with a real question right now. Is the record empty? Is the window closed? That question is too important to answer quickly, and it deserves more than a line. The next chapter goes there directly, because the data on reversal, on what is and is not recoverable, is not what most people expect to find. What it suggests about the body's capacity to respond, even now, even late, is either one of the more hopeful findings in modern exercise physiology or one of the more complicated ones. Probably both. And that's exactly why it's worth understanding precisely. The body knows before the mind admits it. You already felt it this morning. Not dramatically, not with any particular clarity, but in the low-level drag of getting out of bed, the slight deliberateness required to move through what should be automatic. The body that once moved without consultation now asks to be consulted. That gap between what movement used to cost and what it costs now is what you've been carrying. This chapter is about how that gap got there, and about the man who never developed one. Watch Mick Jagger at 82. Not the voice, not the songs. Watch the way he crosses the stage. There is no visible decision in it, no moment of committing. His body does not ask permission from his mind before it moves. It simply moves with the particular ease of a thing that has been done so many times it stopped being a thing and became a property. Like the way water is wet, not a verb, a noun that is not showmanship, not adrenaline, not the crowd feeding him something he would otherwise lack. That is 50 years of accumulated identity made visible in real time. To understand what that means, you have to go back to where the foundation was poured. 1963, the early Stones on a regional UK tour, playing venues that had never considered whether the heating would work. Rehearsal rooms in London with concrete floors cold enough that you could feel it through the soles of cheap shoes. The smell of sawdust and stale cigarette smoke embedded in the curtains. A young man from Dartford, still learning what his body could do, still in the phase where movement required coaxing, where the decision to begin preceded every session, where the decision itself had a cost. Cold room, early morning, the body uncertain, but while having to show up before the body would follow. That is the maintenance phase. Almost everyone who has ever tried to build a physical practice knows it intimately. You feel the friction of going. You build a streak and feel its fragility. You miss a week and the guilt confirms the fragility was real. You return and the entire machinery of convincing yourself restarts. The energy burned in that cycle, in the deciding, the bargaining, the self-recrimination, the recommitment, is not metaphorical. It is a real expenditure, measurable in the nervous system, experienced as a specific kind of exhaustion that compounds over time. Each new cycle of resistance makes the next cycle slightly heavier. Eventually, for most people, the whole structure collapses under its own accumulated weight, and the project gets quietly filed under things that didn't hold. That collapse is not a character failure. It is a systems failure. The failure to cross a specific threshold. The one where a behavior stops being something you do and starts being something you are. Here is what changes on the other side of that threshold. The cost doesn't vanish. The miles are still miles. The sweat is still sweat. What disappears is the tax, the daily referendum, the negotiation with yourself about whether today counts, the quiet dread of the gap between who you are right now and who you're trying to become. When behavior migrates from practice into identity, all of that friction evaporates. Not because the body gets easier to move, but because moving is no longer a project. It is just what you do, the way breathing is what you do, the way reaching for your phone in the morning is what you do. It requires only the absence of interference. Researchers studying long-term exercisers across age groups weren't chasing fitness data. They already knew what that data looked like. They were listening to how people describe themselves. The ones who kept moving through middle age, through illness, through grief, through the full, disrupted catalog of a real life, answered identity questions with a specific grammar. Not, I try to get out for walks. Not, I've been pretty consistent lately. They said, I'm someone who walks. Present tense. Flat declarative. No aspiration in it. No performance of virtue. No implied fragility. The statement didn't reach forward toward a goal. It simply described what was already true. That grammatical difference isn't cosmetic. It reflects a real shift in how the nervous system allocates attention and resources. The identity organizes the behavior. The behavior reinforces the identity. Enough iterations across enough years, and the loop doesn't need to be maintained anymore. It maintains itself. Jagger paid the maintenance cost when it was still a cost. Cold floors, bad heating, the unglamorous repetition of a young body learning its own demands. He paid it long enough and consistently enough that the threshold crossed itself somewhere in the middle of the 60s, in a rehearsal room no one remembers, on an unremarkable afternoon when the act of moving simply stopped requiring a reason. After that, the identity compounded. What you see now, the 82-year-old man who moves as if the stage was built specifically to hold him, is 50 years of that compounding made visible, which the morning Mick Jagger turned 80, a photograph circulated that stopped people mid-scroll. Not a pose shot, not a magazine cover lit to flatter. A candid frame from the side of a stage in Milan. Him moving, not standing, arms loose, weight forward, the same coiled readiness in his body that you can find in footage from 1969 if you pull it up and watch the two of them side by side. People who saw it felt something they couldn't immediately name. Some of them laughed a little defensively. Some of them closed their phones and didn't open them again for a while. Because something in that image pressed on a bruise most men over 40 are carrying quietly. Not envy exactly. Heavier than that. The particular ache of a man who has started doing a private calculation he never did in his 30s. adding up what used to come easily and no longer does, measuring the distance between who he was at 35 and who he is now, wondering whether that distance is just the price of living or whether it was somehow a choice he made without knowing he was making it. The photograph of Jagger moving across that stage in Milan touched that calculation. And then the brain did what brains do when they feel something threatening. It found the exit. The exit is clean and it costs nothing. He has good genes. It's the most comfortable sentence in this entire conversation. If it's true, really true, deterministically true, then nothing here applies, and some of them don't. 25 of those answers live in inherited code. 75 are written somewhere else entirely. And here is what the same research explains. The speed at which their nervous systems return to baseline after stress, the consistency of their social engagement, their relationship to purpose, how they carried difficulty. None of that is written in inherited code. So when someone looks at that photograph from Milan and says, good genes, they are not entirely wrong. Jagger almost certainly carries favorable variants, but they're using a partial truth as a complete explanation, and those are different things. The genome is real. The 25% is real. And the 75% is more real than most men have been told, because the alternative to genetic determinism is uncomfortable in a specific way. If most of what shapes how you age is not fixed at birth, then it responds to input. It responds to what you do, what you return to at the end of a hard day, what you expose your nervous system to repeatedly, how you carry the weight of a life that has been accumulating for 45 years. The instrument is partly inherited, but something else is playing it. That something else has been accumulating evidence for 20 years across disciplines that rarely speak to each other. Behavioral epigenetics, psychoneuroimmunology, chronobiology, the emerging science of what some researchers call allostatic load. They are approaching the same territory from different directions. They are all pointing at the 75%. And here's what that means for the man who saw that photograph and felt that particular wordless weight. The story is not closed. The calculation you've been running privately, the one that measures loss, that tracks distance, that sometimes lands at this is just what happens, that calculation is using incomplete data. The genome gave you a hand to play. It did not play it for you. The mechanism that fills the 75% has a name. It has a measurable biological signature. It shows up consistently across the research once you know what you're looking for. You are about to know what you're looking for. You're sitting with something right now. Maybe you can feel it. Maybe you've just learned to work around it. But when you catch yourself moving carefully on stairs you used to take two at a time. When you wake up and lie still for a moment longer than you need to, listening to your body report back on the night. You know the feeling. You've been carrying it quietly. Here's the news that changes the frame. In June 2024, the Rolling Stones played to more than 60,000 people at Anfield Stadium in Liverpool. Mick Jagger was 80 years old. The set ran 2 hours. Not 2 careful hours, 2 hours of full stage movement, of the kind of breath control that you need to actually sing in front of 60,000 people while crossing a 100-foot runway at pace. The British press reported it the way they report a sporting result. Jagger himself, asked afterward about the physical preparation, mentioned the heat on stage, close to 40 degrees Celsius radiating up from the surface, and said his main concern had been hydration. Not his joints, not his age. Hydration, that's the news. Sit with it for a moment before we do anything with it. If you're over 50 and you watch that footage, and if you're honest about what you felt watching it, something moved in your chest that didn't have a clean name. Not envy. You don't want to be Mick Jagger. Not exactly admiration either, though admiration is in there. Something more uncomfortable. Something that ran a quiet, unsentimental inventory of your own body before you'd consciously decided to do that. You felt it the way you feel a cold room the second you walk in. Before your mind has processed it, your skin already knows. That inventory, the thing your body did automatically, is where this chapter actually lives. The Anfield stage is rough black metal painted to look smooth, and in that heat it smells like scorched rubber and old cable insulation. The crowd noise at that volume isn't sound anymore, it's pressure you feel in the sternum, in the back of your throat. Jagger's shirt was soaked through by the second song, and none of that shows in the movement. The movement is the same quality it's been for decades. Nothing held back, nothing managed, nothing that has the texture of a man being careful with himself. You watch it, and something in you takes a breath that goes slightly shallower than the one before it. What you're feeling has a physical address. Find it now if you can. Somewhere between the chest and the high stomach, a slight pressure. Not painful, but not comfortable. Like something that wants to move and hasn't found a direction yet. Every instinct tells us that feeling is bad news. Evidence of what's slipped, what's narrowing, what's behind us now. But that's the wrong read, and the wrong read is costing people their next decade. Here's what's actually true. A body that has stopped generating that tension has stopped negotiating with its own future. The pressure isn't a warning that the chapter is closing. It's proof the conversation is still live. A dead negotiation produces no friction. What you feel watching Jagger isn't the ache of a closed door. It's the resistance of one that's still on its hinges. The question is what you do with that. Not philosophically, physically, practically today. Because here's what Jagger's body has actually been doing. Not through magic, not through genetics alone, but through something more transferable. It never stopped treating that tension as information rather than verdict. Never tried to resolve the feeling by stopping the conversation that generated it. The rehearsals, the movement training, the cardiovascular work he's been doing with a trainer for years. None of that was aimed at eliminating the gap between what his body had been and what it could still be. It was aimed at staying in relation to that gap, at working with the grain of it rather than against it. That's not a metaphor. That's a training principle, and it has a physiology. The pressure you feel watching 60,000 people cheer a man your age or older move without apology across a stage in 40-degree heat is not telling you that you failed. It's telling you that your body still registers the difference between where it is and where it could be. That registration, that ongoing sensitivity to the gap, is the very mechanism that makes change possible. It only goes quiet when the body has decided the conversation is over. You haven't decided that. The tension is the evidence. So you can set the footage down feeling heavier than when you started. One more reminder of something you're not. Or you can let it do what it's actually trying to do. Point your attention with some precision towards something that still has capacity in it, toward a body that is still, right now, in the middle of writing its story rather than sealed up in its ending. That pressure between your chest and your stomach is not the weight of what's behind you. It's the signal that what's ahead is still worth negotiating for. That's not comfort. That's better than comfort. That's the actual situation. And the actual situation, it turns out, is considerably less final than the story you've been carrying. Walk a little differently today. Not because Jagger did, because your body just told you it's still listening. There is a mechanism underneath all of this. The researchers are beginning to find it, though they're not yet calling it what it is, because science moves carefully and the territory still makes laboratories nervous. But when you set aside the language they use and watch what the numbers are actually tracking, something becomes visible that most people have already felt, not as an idea, but as a physical fact registered somewhere between the sternum and the throat. Start with what the body does when it contracts. The sensation is familiar without needing introduction. A headline lands wrong, and something in the chest pulls inward, like a slow fist closing around nothing in particular. The shoulders move forward and up, almost imperceptibly. The breath shortens, not stops, just shortens, as though the body is rationing air it isn't sure will keep coming. The jaw finds a position and holds it. None of this is dramatic. None of it is visible. A person could be standing in a grocery store, reading their phone, and every one of these processes could be running simultaneously while someone nearby asks about the canned tomatoes, and the answer comes back without a beat missed. That is contraction, and the body sustains it the way a building sustains its structure, through constant, invisible, expensive load-bearing that never appears in any accounting until something fails. In 2021, a collaborative research group at Heidelberg and Oslo published findings from a longitudinal study tracking what they called identity coherence in adults between 60 and 85. They were measuring whether a person's felt sense of continuous selfhood, the experience of being the same person with an ongoing project, not a person managing a diminishing resource, correlated with objective health outcomes. It did, more strongly than exercise frequency alone, more strongly than diet quality alone. The subjects whose nervous systems were registering the signal of a self still in forward motion showed measurably better outcomes across nearly every biomarker the team tracked: inflammatory markers, cardiovascular flexibility, cognitive function, immune regulation. The researchers noted it as a promising avenue for further investigation. They did not know what to call the signal. The data, however, was not ambiguous. A separate group at the University of California, Davis, running longitudinal behavioral studies ostensibly aimed at stress and aging, kept arriving at a similar anomaly. The people who aged most slowly, biologically speaking, were not the people who had experienced the least stress. They were the people whose bodies spent more time in a particular state. What the researchers called, with careful precision, behavioral engagement. Continuous directional expression. The nervous system's ongoing registration that the self was moving towards something rather than defending against something. Expansion, in other words, though neither paper uses that word. This is where Mick Jagger becomes something more than an anecdote about an energetic rock musician. He has been in that state with rare interruptions for 60 years. The rehearsals he still runs at 82 are not maintenance. They are expression. The choreography is not exercise undertaken for health. It is the continued declaration of a self that is not finished, not retreating, not managing its exit, not rationing itself against an uncertain future, but still arriving. Structure years to move through peer review and into the mainstream. But the body registered the difference long before the research began. The question this leaves, and it is worth sitting with rather than resolving too quickly. You already know the feeling, not the dramatic version, not collapse, not crisis, but the lower, quieter one. The one that shows up in the morning before you've done anything wrong yet. You lie there, and the first thing your mind does is run the inventory. What hurts? What's slower than it used to be? What you meant to do yesterday and didn't. And underneath all of it, the thing that's hardest to say out loud. The sense that your body has its own agenda and you've been losing the argument with it for a while now. That feeling is not weakness. It's not ingratitude, but it is doing something to your biology that matters. And the mechanism is more specific and more reversible than most people are ever told. Stay with that feeling for a moment before we move anywhere. Because the instinct, when someone starts talking about what's possible, is to rush toward the solution and leave the tension behind. But the tension is the point, not as a problem to escape, as information to read. Here's what it's telling you. The body keeps a record that has nothing to do with the one you keep consciously. Not the record of sleep hours and protein grams and skipped workouts. A different record. A record of who you believe yourself to be moment to moment inside your own skin. And that record, it turns out, runs the machinery at a level that effort never quite reaches. Not the discipline layered on top, the identity underneath. There's a study out of Yale, led by a psychologist named Becca Levy, who spent decades on this specifically, that followed ordinary people across 23 years. Not sick people, not optimized people. People. The finding was this. Those who held more positive self-perceptions of aging live an average of 7.5 years longer than those who didn't. 7.5 years. That number is larger than the survival benefit attributed to low blood pressure. Larger than not smoking. Larger than maintaining a healthy weight, each measured separately. A single self-perception carried over time outperformed every standard clinical lever we throw at the problem of human longevity. This is where I want to be careful, because this is exactly where findings like this get flattened into something useless, into a poster, into just believe harder. That's not what Levy found, and it's not what I'm saying. What she found was that the identity a person inhabits, the felt bodily sense of who they are in relation to aging, directly regulates measurable biology, hormonal output, cardiovascular response, inflammatory markers. The body was not reading mood. It was reading identity. Those are not the same thing. You can be in a bad mood. You can be tired. You can be skeptical of everything in this video and still carry an identity that, below all of that, says, I am someone whose body knows how to adapt. I'm not finished. Those things coexist. And when they coexist, the body responds to the identity, not the mood on top of it. I want to give you something specific to hold. Keep run that inventory, what's wrong, what's slipping, what isn't working, from the identity of someone whose body is failing them. You're broadcasting a threat signal continuously below the level of In the weeks after Mick Jagger's open heart surgery in March 2019, aortic valve replacement, a procedure serious enough that the Rolling Stones postponed their entire North American tour. The medical consensus was essentially this: a man of 75, with a career built on 2.5 hours of continuous stage performance, would need months of careful rehabilitation, possibly longer. The kind of guarded, incremental return that doctors describe when they are managing expectations downward. He was back on stage in Chicago that July, 13 weeks later, not shuffling through a reduced set, not sitting on a stool and letting the band carry it, running, spinning, covering the width of a stadium stage in the same lunging, elastic way he'd been doing it since 1969. The footage circulated with the particular quality that footage of Jagger in motion always has, that slight wrongness of scale, the gap between what the eye expects from a septuagenarian recovering from cardiac surgery and what it's actually receiving. If you have been carrying something heavy lately, the low-grade exhaustion that doesn't lift after sleep, the sense that your body is working against you instead of with you, the dread that sits in the chest before the day has even properly started, then that footage is either inspiring or it's infuriating. Maybe both. The infuriating version is legitimate. It's worth sitting with for a moment before moving past it. Because the question the footage raises isn't really about Jagger. It's about the 13 weeks, about what a person does, specifically and physically, when they have decided that the stage is still where they belong. Here is what is documented about how he lives. Not rumor, not profile mythology. What the people around him have consistently described, and what his body has consistently demonstrated. He moves every day, ballet several times a week, not as vanity, not as eccentricity, but because ballet demands something that running on a treadmill cannot replicate. Bilateral coordination, proprioceptive precision, the sustained cognitive load of holding and executing choreographic sequences while the body is under eccentric muscular stress. Researchers tracking older adults through complex movement protocols versus simple walking found that walkers improve cardiovascular markers. Dancers improve cardiovascular markers and showed measurable increases in hippocampal volume, the brain region most vulnerable to age-related atrophy, the one that when it goes, takes memory and spatial orientation with it. Jagger at 75 wasn't just protecting his heart. He was protecting the architecture of the brain that would need to navigate a stage in the dark, in front of 60,000 people, without losing his place. He doesn't move gently. The output he has committed to, a full stadium performance, requires a specific input. That isn't a philosophy. It's arithmetic. The training is calibrated to the demand. And the demand is not abstract. It has a date on it. It has a city and a venue and a crowd that has already bought tickets. His sleep is treated with the seriousness of the surgery itself. People close to him describe a man who doesn't drink before performance nights, who manages light and transition with intention, who treats the hours before sleep as part of the preparation, not the end of the day. This matters more than it sounds. Men past 50 who consistently fall below 6.5 hours of quality sleep show accelerated losses in muscle protein synthesis, elevated inflammatory cytokines, and degraded insulin sensitivity. 3 systems failing simultaneously, each making the others worse. each working directly against the kind of physical recovery that gets a person back on stage in 13 weeks rather than 18 months. Sleep isn't where the body idles. It's where it repairs the thing the day broke. The food is not ideological. No doctrine, no flag. What people around him describe is attention, eating with awareness of what the body needs to do next. Fish, vegetables, Japanese food mention more than once a consistent orientation toward not overfilling. The framing isn't moral. It's mechanical. The body has a job. The food is in service of the job. None of this is inaccessible. That is the honest read. No exotic interventions. No private specialist performing procedures unavailable to ordinary people. Movement, sleep, food. The same three variables everyone already knows matter, arranged with a consistency that most people don't manage, not because the methods are difficult, but because the reason for them is blurry. Jagger returned from open-heart surgery in 13 weeks because his body had been prepared for decades to recover quickly and perform at a specific level. But the preparation was downstream of something else entirely. He does not appear to be a man managing decline. He appears to be a man with a specific job, and the job requires a specific body, and the body gets what it needs to do the job. The 13 weeks are not a miracle. They are the result of a decade of Tuesdays, which is where the question lands, quietly and with some weight. What does your body think its job is? Not the job you describe if someone asked. The job your actual habits are preparing it for. The answer is already written in how you move, how you sleep, what you feed it, and how much margin you've left for recovery when something breaks. The footage from Chicago in July 2019 is worth watching again with that question in place. Not to measure yourself against it, to feel the gap, if there is one, between where the body you're living in is pointed and where you actually intend to go. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. You know the one. It arrives around the third week of something new, a routine you built carefully, a commitment you made with genuine conviction, and it doesn't announce itself as fatigue. It announces itself as a faint, sourceless suspicion that you are working against something that isn't going to move. Not a wall exactly, more like weather. Like the effort is real, but the terrain keeps shifting underneath it, and somewhere in the chest, below the level of language, a question forms that you don't quite let yourself ask directly. What if this is just what it is now? That feeling, that low, specific dread, is not a character flaw. It is not weakness. It is information. It is the body reporting with remarkable accuracy the state of a particular relationship. Before we name what that relationship is, stay with the physical fact of this for a moment. Think about a man crossing a stage. Not a concept of the man, not the mythology, the actual footage. 82 years old, under lights engineered to expose every hesitation, in front of an audience that has been watching him for 60 years and knows every version of how he moves. He crosses the stage the way water crosses a surface it belongs to. Not carefully, not with the micromanaged precision of someone navigating around something fragile. Happening what was a battle has become, without drama and expression. The movement is no longer fighting the body toward a goal. The movement is the body expressing. This identity never accepted its own obsolescence as the primary organizing truth. And the body, being a system that responds to instruction rather than simply executing a predetermined program, organized itself around what it was given, is still organizing itself around what it is given. On a stage, in the lights, at 82, with the bass frequencies arriving in your sternum and 70,000 people watching to see if this time the war will show. The war doesn't show, because there isn't one. Now return to that low dread in the chest, the third week feeling, the suspicion that the effort is working against something that isn't going to move. That feeling is the body accurately reporting incoherence, the condition in which the identity that inhabits you and the instructions the work is trying to send are not the same transmission. Two signals moving in opposite directions, and the body doing what any precision system does when it receives contradictory data. It defaults to the signal with the longest repetition and the deepest history. For most people past 40, that signal was built quietly over decades, from medical conversations framed around the management of loss, from cultural jokes that arrived as biological fact, from every well-meaning voice that said at your age and meant it kindly. The body received that as instruction. It has been running on it. And every new protocol, every good food choice, every discipline applied with genuine intention, when it runs up against that older, louder, more historically reinforced signal, it registers in the body as friction, as battle, as the specific exhaustion that is not about sleep. The work doesn't change. The commitment doesn't change. The discipline, the nutrition, the movement, the recovery, none of that becomes unnecessary. But the nature of it changes entirely when the identity generating the instructions and the body receiving them are finally, actually sending the same message. You have felt this before, not hypothetically, in your own body, in your own history. Some moment when something that had been a struggle changed texture without your engineering the change. A door you'd been pushing against that one day opened as though it had always been open. The exertion was the same. The direction was the same. But the quality of what you were moving through is different. Cooler somehow, less turbulent, like the difference between walking into a headwind and walking out of one. Same legs, same ground, different relationship between the body and where it's going. That moment wasn't luck. That was coherence arriving. The system running the way it was built to run, when the identity and the instruction finally stopped contradicting each other. It happened once, which means it is not foreign to you, which means the next part of this conversation has somewhere real to land. There's an answer to the question this video has been circling. The one about whether the coherence between what you believe yourself to be and what your body receives as instruction can be built continuously, not just in isolated moments of effort or intention. It can. And Mick Jagger is not the proof of that because he is exceptional. He is the proof of that because he is consistent. Not consistent the way a training log is consistent. Every Wednesday, every protocol, every measured intake. Consistent the way a current is consistent. Picture the Thames moving through February. Nobody is deciding that. The river moves because that is the nature of what it has become. The body follows identity the same way. Not because it is inspired, because it has been told repeatedly what it is dealing with. What frequency of input to expect. What kind of person is in charge of it. That is what coherence means when it has become structural rather than occasional. The nervous system stops bracing when it stops being surprised. When the identity you project inward is the same one that shows up Monday and Thursday, and at the end of a long, grinding news cycle, the body stops spending energy on recalibration. It stops waiting for the other shoe, and that recovered energy goes somewhere. It goes into repair, into resilience, into the precise biological processes that the research keeps pointing toward when it asks, why some people seem to age differently than their calendar suggests. You felt that coherence breakdown. You know the day after a week of heavy news when the body feels 2 sizes too small for everything you need to do. That is not imagination. That is the cost of a system that has been running on alert, receiving contradictory signals about who is in control and whether the ground beneath is solid. The body is not being dramatic. It is being accurate. What this video has been working toward is not a morning practice or a supplement stack or a reframing philosophy. It is something quieter and more structural than any of those things. It is the question of where you stand when the world arrives. Not which source you consult, not which notification you allow. The stance from which the information lands on you, whether you are upright and rooted when it hits, or already off balance before you've finished reading the headline. That stance can be trained, not optimized, trained, the way posture is trained, slowly, through repetition, until it becomes the default rather than the effort. That is why this channel exists. Not to give you another feed, not to perform wellness or promise that the right information will finally fix what's been wrong. This channel exists because the news is not going to stop being heavy. The geopolitical weight that opened this video, the tension, the uncertainty, the sense that very large things are moving in directions that are difficult to track. None of that resolves because you found a more optimistic podcast. The world presses in. It is always pressed in. What changes is where you stand when it arrives. Bio Upgrade is built for that. Every video here starts from a real event. Something already on the television, already in the feed, already producing that particular tightness in the chest before you've fully registered what you're reading. We don't look away from it. We don't soften it in a metaphor before we've reported what's actually happening. The weight of the event gets the space it deserves. Because you are not someone who needs to be protected from reality. You are someone who needs a more stable place to stand when reality walks through the door. The people who stay here do not stay because the content is comforting. They stay because it is honest. Because it sits with the difficulty of a real story long enough to actually work through it. Not past it, not around it. And comes out the other side with something practical and grounded. If that describes where you are right now, then subscribing is simply the act of saying you'd like that to happen again, regularly, as a practice, not a one-time visit. Because that is what this has to be to matter. A single video can open something, but the coherence we have been talking about, the kind that becomes structural because it has been repeated enough to stop feeling like effort, that requires return. It requires the habit of receiving the world this way more than once. The bell icon is there. Use it if you want to be here when the next heavy headline arrives, before the dread has time to settle in and make itself at home. There is one more thing worth sitting with before this video closes. We have talked about what it means to build coherence between identity and body. There's a particular kind of fatigue that's settled in over the last several months. And if you've been watching the news at all, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Not the breaking news spike, not the acute alarm of a single headline. The chronic kind. The kind that arrives before you've finished your first coffee, accumulates through the afternoon, and is still sitting in your chest when you try to sleep. Markets swinging on policy announcements nobody fully understands. Conflict zones expanding in ways the maps can't quite keep up with. The slow grind of inflation data, institutional credibility eroding in real time. The background hum of a world that seems to be running faster than anyone's ability to orient to it. Most men in their 50s and 60s aren't panicking. They're just tired in a way that rest doesn't quite fix. That specific tiredness is what I want to start with, because it is not weakness. It is, in fact, the honest cost of paying attention. But it has a physiology, and that physiology has consequences that are worth understanding before we get to what Mick Jagger did last month. Because here's what actually happened. Jagger performed at 82. Not a brief appearance, not a nostalgic cameo staged carefully around his limitations. A full set in front of tens of thousands of people with the same lights, the same volume, the same physical demands the stage has always made. Reviewers noted he moved differently than he did at 60. Obviously. But the coverage kept returning to the same bewildered observation. He was genuinely, functionally there. Not performing presence. Present. The body absorbed 2+ hours of it and came out the other side still recognizably his. The question that keeps getting asked about it is the wrong one. Everyone wants to know what he does, the diet, the regimen, the specific maintenance rituals of a man who has been famously disciplined about his instruments since his heart surgery in 2004. Those details are real and documented and not uninteresting, but they miss what is actually unusual about him. What is unusual is that Jagger never interrupted the conversation. And most of us, somewhere between 40 and 60 did. The conversation, is not metaphorical. It has a direction and a chemistry. When a man maintains a sustained sense of purpose, not contentment, not comfort, but genuine forward engagement with something that still matters to him, his body receives that signal continuously. Research coming out of behavioral medicine and longitudinal aging studies over the last 2 decades has been converging on something that should probably be getting more attention in the mainstream. The body is not simply declining. It is responding, chronically, constantly, to the information the life being lived inside it is sending. Chronic threat response. The kind that low-grade dread produces, the kind that the current news environment is genuinely good at sustaining, runs the body's resources toward defense and away from maintenance. Inflammatory activity increases. Cellular repair slows. Over months and years, those differences compound in ways that show up as biological age rather than calendar age. The fatigue that doesn't respond to sleep. The recovery that takes longer than it used to. These are not simply the inevitable products of time. They are, in significant part, the products of the ongoing signal. Jagger's signal, sustained across decades, has consistently said, "There is still something I am moving toward." That is a different instruction than most men his age have been sending their bodies for the last 20 years. Now here is where the law of vibration becomes practical rather than theoretical. Everything you are carrying right now, the market anxiety, the geopolitical dread, the specific weight of staying informed in a news cycle designed to keep threat response running, has a frequency. Your nervous system is not processing it abstractly. It is processing it as chemistry, as electrical signal, as instruction to every system in your body about whether you are in danger or not. That instruction is happening whether you are aware of it or not. What the law of vibration offers, not as philosophy, but as a working tool, is this: the frequency at which you receive information is something you can consciously shift, not by ignoring the information, not by pretending the markets are stable or the world is simpler than it is, by choosing deliberately where you stand when the information arrives. Observer rather than inhabitant, witness rather than merger. That shift is not spiritual. It is physiological. When you engage news and difficulty from a position of grounded witness, rather than reactive absorption, you are sending a different signal. The body reads it. The inflammatory response adjusts. The repair work continues. The law of attraction follows from this. The sustained internal state you maintain is the attractor. It is what your nervous system, your decisions, your attention, and ultimately your physical condition organize around. Hold chronic threat, and the body organizes toward defense. Hold purposeful engagement, even with difficult material, even with real stakes, and the body organizes differently. Jagger, whatever his relationship to these frameworks explicitly, has been practicing exactly this for 60 years. He does not appear to merge with the chaos around him. He moves through it and arrives at the other side, still recognizably himself, caring about the music genuinely without becoming the noise surrounding it. That distinction, caring without becoming, is the actual practice. It is not taught anywhere easily. It has no label, but it is functionally what separates bodies that are running 10 years behind their calendar age for bodies that are running 10 years ahead. The news is not going to slow down. The pressures are real and will remain real and deserve to be engaged honestly. Nothing here suggests otherwise. But the man on the stage last month, at 82, under full lights, throwing everything at it and walking off still intact. He spent decades learning to receive the world from a position that didn't cost him what it cost most of us. That is learnable, not easily, but learnable. The conversation your body is listening to right now is already underway. The question is only what it's been hearing and whether you want to change the signal.